My name's Anthony Underwood, and welcome to this special episode of Greetings from Appalachia. We're going to be commemorating the 100th anniversary of the Battle of Blair Mountain and the ending of the West Virginia Mine Wars by interviewing the executive director of the West Virginia Mine Wars Museum located in Matewan, West Virginia, Kenzie New Walker, and museum volunteer and member of the local United Mine Workers of America, Terry Steele. It is truly an excellent interview with some remarkable and dedicated people. The Battle of Blair Mountain was the culmination of a 9-year confrontation between miners seeking to unionize for the most basic of rights that we now take for granted, and coal operators and owners who had co-opted the state government and local law enforcement to stop unionization by any means necessary, including the mass murder of women and children. In 1921, when the coal operators of Mingo County began to jail union organizing miners without arrest, incident, or conviction, this represented the suspension of the Constitution in Mingo County without any authority to do so. 10,000 miners, many veterans of World War I, met just south of Charleston, the state capital, and began an armed march to restore the Constitution in Mingo County. Meeting them in Logan County, halfway in between, was Sheriff Don Chafin, regional volunteers, and the newly created state police for a battle defined by trenches, machine gun nests, and the only time that the United States government has used airplanes to bomb its own citizens, the miners' army. The battle ended in favor of the mine owners with the intervention of the U.S. Army. You can still find secret stores of weapons in those mountains where miners, instead of surrendering them, hid them away for the next uprising that never came. It was the biggest armed uprising since the Civil War, and it was in the name of preserving the Constitution and basic human rights. And it all happened here in West Virginia, in the heart of Appalachia. Enjoy the interview. Welcome to the show, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. We're really excited to talk about the West Virginia Mine Wars and the great work that the museum does. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you,
Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely. Great to have you. So, too many people still have no idea or have very, very little knowledge about the West Virginia Mine Wars, despite how incredibly important they were to both the state and to American labor history. Can you share with our viewers who may be unfamiliar, just briefly, what the West Virginia Mine Wars were about and why they're still important?
Yeah, I can jump in. So the West Virginia Mine Wars was a culmination of a struggle for the right to join a union. This period is really marked by company ownership, which meant that the company owned the churches, the company owned the supply stores, the company owned the school, and dictated what was going to be taught in school. And so the company also controlled local or hired private guards to control what was happening in these towns. And so they had this like really extraordinary large reach, and they controlled really the day-to-day movements and interactions that miners were having. They would control like who was coming in and out of town. And so ultimately the Mine Wars is a story of folks coming together to fight back and fight for their rights to join a union.
Joining a union would mean not only did you lose your job, you lost your house, you lost your school, you lost your doctor, you lost everything.
Yeah, so that's totally true. Miners at this time, they had to pay rent because the only housing options available in company towns were the houses that the company owned. And so whenever you would join a union or you'd go on strike, not only were you out of a job, but you were homeless, you know. And so essentially, the Battle of Blair Mountain is the culmination of a decades-long struggle that happened in 1921. It happened 100 years ago as we're speaking, you know, today.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, miners ended up banding together. It was a really diverse group of folks who banded together on Blair Mountain. So you had Black workers who migrated from the South, you had native born white mountaineers, and then you had European immigrants.
Absolutely. A lot of folks for whom English would not necessarily have been the first language.
Yeah. So they had to figure out ways that they could communicate, you know, without knowing each other. And this was actually by design. You know, there's a coal operator named Justice Collins who pushed for a judicious mixture in the coal camps, is what he called it. And so they wanted to actively seek out people who did not speak the same language, people who did not have the same religion, people who weren't from the same place, because they were less likely, they believed they were less likely to band together. And then the miners on Blair Mountain would later prove Justice Collins wrong.
And I think that's a fascinating part of the story. I happened to see the art installation you advertised on your website or on your Facebook account yesterday, maybe, talking about the passwords that were used. They had to create passwords so that all backgrounds would understand them. And I think the one that was highlighted in the post was "I come creeping" as the password, because that was something that everybody could understand what it meant. So yeah, I find that fascinating. We're often a lot more diverse here in Appalachia than people give us credit for. So okay, great. And why do you think that's still relevant today?
Well, just to add a little bit to what Mackenzie said too, and a little bit to what you said just a few minutes ago about why the people don't know about this history, and don't feel bad about it, because I was born within probably 500 feet of where the shootout in Matewan took place, and graduated from Matewan High School in 1970, and I didn't know the history either. So it's don't feel bad if you don't know the history, because the people who grew up in the area and lived in these areas didn't know their own history either. So, but we do know that the reason it should be, well, the old saying, you know, if you don't know your history, maybe you're going to repeat the same mistakes over again.
That's true.
And I think that's what we're actually doing now, maybe a little bit in this country, because unions give us so much. You know, they give us the 40-hour work week. They give us health care. They gave us pensions. They give us safety, you know, that kept people alive. So I think a lot of those things are being taken away now. And the reason a lot of them are taken away is because we don't know our history. So, yeah, this is, we have to get back to why we have these good things that we have in life now. And we need to learn where they came from and why we have them.
So much of what we call middle class comfort, you know, the things you talk about, came from a union putting their foot down and their backs into it and saying no more. We're going to, you know, we all deserve a good life, and fighting not just for their future, but really for all workers' future when they did that. So I think you're very, very right about that. That's a important point, I think, to share. So do you think that it's changed, that level of knowledge? I know that's part of the mission of the museum itself. But even when, you know, I'm a little bit younger, so even when I was teaching about the mine wars, 15 or so years ago, when I was teaching, I was teaching high school students from all over the state, like in summer programs, and these were the best students we could find, and almost none of them knew about. They knew about Matewan a little bit because of the movie. But when it came to the mine wars, the actual mine wars and the battle, nothing. They were fascinated by it. They loved learning about it, but they knew nothing. Do you think that's changed?
I think it's changing. I like to think that because of the work of the museum that we're doing. I don't I don't think your experience isn't unique. I think one of the most common phrases that we hear in the museum from visitors is, we didn't learn about this in school, and today, if you go to Blair Mountain, you blink and you'll miss it.
Being chopped up and mined, and I mean, it's a shame.
Yeah, and so one thing that we talk about in the museum is like, not learning this history isn't just by happenstance. It was by design. In one of the museum's exhibits, this is a new addition that we have in our new space, which is owned by UMWA Local 1440, which is essentially the heartbeat of the town of Mate One. You'll see in one of our last exhibits an exhibit case that has about 5 or 6 different history textbooks. And it starts in the 30s with the Works Progress Administration and a letter that details, about writing the state's history. And Homer Holt, who was the governor at the time, said he didn't want 3 things mentioned. He didn't want any mention about Mother Jones, who, of course, was a key organizer during the West Virginia Mine Wars. He didn't want any mention about the Weirton steel strikes. And he didn't want any mention about the Miners' March. And so right in the 30s, 10 years after Blair Mountain, you start to see this omission, this censorship, and it follows. And so we have textbooks that come from the 30s all the way to the 80s that should show, the details about the mine wars, details about union organizing in West Virginia, but it's completely left out.
Right. I can remember, and I graduated high school in 1990, so the 80s were mine. I took the Golden Horseshoe test, like a lot of high school students in West Virginia do. Not one single question wasn't in the study material, wasn't asked about, wasn't referenced, not at all.
And that's bizarre to me. This is the largest armed uprising since the Civil War in the United States, and it's not mentioned.
Yeah.
It's really bizarre. So one thing that's a key central part at the museum is we created, an entire teacher's toolkit. If you go to our website, wvminewars.org, you can access it. It's free. We've got a 2-week unit plan where folks can learn about how, people built community when there was no union, how they, communicated with each other, how they came together, why, they needed to have a union because of the excessive overreach of these companies. And so we have that toolkit available. We also offer field trips to the museum, which is something that Terry's wife, Wilma Steele, who's a founding board member of the museum, helps with. And she makes sure that no student leaves without a red bandana in their hand and that they know the story of the West Virginia Mine Wars. And so I think it is changing. I think there's plenty more work to do around it. Mm-hmm. Because like even today, even though the Mine Wars is mentioned in textbooks, it's like a footnote, know? And so teachers, they have to, create their own resources. And we've heard from teachers, about our lessons. They're like, these are awesome. They're very well designed. They're using them. And the students respond really well. It gets them excited.
So you've talked about referenced a couple of times so far the March on Mingo that culminated in the confrontation at Blair Mountain, the Battle of Blair Mountain. A lot of times when it is discussed, that march is portrayed as a contest between rampaging miners and the forces of law and order, the sheriff's deputies, the mine guards, the newly created West Virginia State Police that were just created because of the march and everything around it. But we know that's not what it was really about. It wasn't really about law and order versus the miners. It was about something deeper. What would you say is, if somebody asked, what was that March on Mingo really about? What would you say?
I'll try to answer that.
Sure.
I'll jump in too, Terry, if you want.
Okay. Go. I think if you want to say one thing that it's about justice. When people are fed up to a point that they just can't seem to take any more, then most of the time it leads to some kind of action.
Yeah.
And a lot of times it leads to a bloodletting, I guess you would say. When things get to a point that you have to take things into your own hands, when the law is not, or the so-called law is not, is just seems to be one-sided for a group of individuals. And this happens often, and people, it's what leads to protest, and it leads to protest today, that the law at times seems to be one-sided. But if I was going to pick a word, I would say it was all about justice for these people, and how they went about trying to get something that they should have had anyhow, and how they were being abused.
Right.
It leads oftentimes to demonstrations that we even see even today, that certain people look at and say, well, that's not right. But if you're not those people, you don't really know what they're even, why they're even fighting for, and I think that's some of our problems in this country, that we don't realize. We haven't learned our history, and we have things certain people have it too good, and they don't realize why it is this good.
Right. And I think you said to say it was about justice. That's an inspiring thing to say, because miners in Mingo who were trying to organize were being thrown in jail without without court orders, without being accused of actually breaking any laws, because the Mingo government was owned by the coal operators. And so there was a great injustice taking place. And like you said, the miners who had been, had all sorts of injustices heaped on their heads for decades, finally said, this far and no farther. So, Kenzie, were you going to say something?
I was just going to say Terry, I think you're right on the money. The miners, their destination wasn't Blair Mountain. It was to get to Mingo County to free their Union brothers who were jailed, so.
Okay. Yeah. So kind of looping back around to that, and what in your statements earlier. So as we think about people like Mother Jones, when you think about people like Bill Blizzard, the other folks who were leaders in the labor movement in West Virginia, especially among miners, if they were to time travel and be around today, what would they think about the labor movement now?
Well, let me try to give you I just got back here. It's not been a month ago from down in Alabama at a mine strike. It's been going on down there, I think, since April, about 1,100 miners. And I think what we deal with today is probably harder in ways than even what our forefathers had to deal with, because we're dealing with big, huge corporations that are controlled mostly by Wall Street. And when you go with corporations, they have other resources to turn to. Just like a lot of these, they can maybe get coal from Australia or be supplied from some other resource, which makes it extremely hard on these people to try to hold on to their benefits. So that's one thing that I think that our maybe forefathers didn't have to deal with in a way. Of course, they dealt with a lot more, but I'm sure if they could come back and just see, they left us, especially, I always tell everyone, the FDR people, the greatest generation, as we call them, left us in great shape. I mean, they did. They left us with unions. They left us with hope. The main thing. They always thought that their kids would have a better future than what they had lived. And we believed that even into the late 70s and early 80s. I think it actually started in the 80s when we was really going downhill on a skid. But now we seem to have taken those benefits, and this is one of the words you may have to cut out, but just pissed them away, So that's pretty well. I think they would really be disappointed if they could see how we took what they give us and not protected it or let other people take it away without even, they take it away without any bloodshed in a sense.
Yeah, and you look at the not obviously it's not the same industry, but the vote to unionize at the Amazon warehouse down in Alabama, and it was defeated. But we learn after the fact that it looks like Amazon cheated, that they cheated in that vote. And how many times in our history do we find that the owners, whether they're coal mine owners or online superstore owners, are cheating when we try to play honest and get to where we want to be, in terms of benefits and pay and where we should be. So Kenzie, can you tell us a little bit more about how the museum is going to continue to celebrate and commemorate the Battle of Blair Mountain for this 100th anniversary?
Yeah, so the museum received a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities in 2017, and the grant program is called Creating Humanities Communities. So it's all about bringing people together, to share in their heritage. And I think the museum's been really successful in bringing different types of groups and people together to remember this history. And I think there's a lot of ways that it's going to be remembered over Labor Day weekend. So we'll see music and labor concerts. We're going to see, folks talk about the legacy of the red bandana, how it's being used by organizations today to cause good trouble. We'll have a church service that is like a dissident church service, so it will be the exact opposite of what folks would find in a company church, and how miners would organize themselves. We'll have reenactments, including the United Mine Workers of America, who is leading a 50-mile reenactment of the Miners' March. Terry tells me he's going to walk the entire thing.
Wow.
Terry didn't tell her that.
I'm kidding. But yeah, I think it's just so, I think it's really cool to see like all these different groups come together and say, you know what, here's what we can offer. Here's what we're going to do to remember Blair Mountain. And the more folks that we can get talking about Blair Mountain, I think the better, the bigger impact that we're going to have.
Right.
But of course, this is just one weekend. Which there will be some things that happen to remember Blair Mountain afterwards. And so the museum's going to continue, remembering Blair Mountain and remembering the mine wars. One thing that our team has marked as a priority is to, get some interpretive signage up along the Miners' March. Mm-hmm. Like I said earlier, along the Miners' March, and also like at the actual battlefield, because like I said, if you go there today, you'll blink and you'll miss it. There's just one historic marker there that was issued by SHPO. And so there's definitely a lot more that can be done. I think Matewan is an exception to the rule, and the fact that Matewan, we've done a really good job there in promoting our history. By and large, it's been thanks to Local 1440 and their partnership, but there's also other organizations in town, including the museum, that lift up this history. So I think, just creating things at these places that folks can go and see the place where history happens. I think it's different when you can actually stand where the miners stood 100 years ago. So yeah, I think, having those interpretive sites there, as well as continuing to promote education in schools, making sure that students, young people are learning this history and leaving the classroom with it, I think is really important. in addition, one thing that the museum will be doing is partnering with Coalfield Development to create a new interpretive site in Mate 1 for Sid Hatfield's apartment.
Oh, that will be great.
Yeah, I think it'll be really cool, and we're going to work with the community on this to figure out, how we want this space to operate, what it's going to look like, and especially to celebrate, the diversity in the coal camps and talk about the experience that immigrants have. I know it's something that Wilma Steele also feels very strongly about. It's the Ninny building. It was named after an Italian immigrant family. So I think, yeah, there's a lot that we have in the pipeline, but those are three,
Right.
major programs that we have coming up next.
Fantastic. I really can't thank you two enough for being willing to be here on our show. We really wanted to do something very specific for Labor Day and the time around Labor Day that dealt with Appalachian heritage and West Virginia history and those types of things. And of course, this was the first thing on my list. So thank you both very much. I also want to thank you both, and I know Wilma couldn't be here, but to her too, and all the rest of your board members for the incredible work you're doing. This is the type of thing that's the real history of West Virginia. It's one of our foundational events and parts of our history, and everything you can do to make sure that more folks hear about it, especially kids, so they'll have it with them all their life, is incredibly worthwhile. So thank you both very much.
I'd like to say something about their board the board. I think that they have at this museum is pretty unique, pretty special. I think about every one of them wrote a book that's on this board.
That ain't true.
They're really they're workers. Good. And they work together, which I think you have to do. And we work with them, and two people that's in our local. I don't know. We at one time had the largest UMWA local, probably in the country. I know in the state we had over 1,200 members in this local at Mate 1. Right. And sadly, they have died off for an inactive local, and we're down to around 800 members now. But we have two officers in that local that work their hind ends off, and Danny Whitt and Hawkeye Dixon, who do everything that they can to promote this history and make sure that it gets promoted along with this board there. So we're a good team down there, and we just love for everyone to come to this little town and see what's happening, what could happen when you work together in this.
We're going to make sure and put all that information up on the screen here at the end of the interview, so everybody sees how to connect and how to get there and participate. So we'll make sure that they see that. And again, the idea that folks are taking control of their own history and making sure that it stays alive and gets passed on is an incredibly important part of our culture. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.